now it's time for us to move into our first panel discussion. And joining Nick Wilson and Mr. Nilo in the panel is Michael Haggard, lead partner of the Haggard Law Firm and an honorary board member of the Melissa Institute. Michael is no stranger to gun violence and has represented hundreds of individuals and families affected by this epidemic. As gun violence has evolved into mass shootings, Michael found himself representing the families from the Marjory Stoneman Douglas, from the University of Virginia, and most recently, the hate crime mass shooting at the Dollar General store in Jacksonville. Haggard hopes to give victims the tools and resources to help rebuild their lives by convincing a judge or a jury to hold those responsible accountable. And he gives victims and their families a sense of justice and comfort that another family won't have to go through the same tragedy. In terms of how we're going to operate now, we're going to ask Michael to share his initial kind of like reactions to both Nick's and Nilo. And we also give Nilo and Nick an opportunity also to add to this. We will then have questions. So if folks in the audience, the questions, please send them to the Q&A section. Those are the only ones that I'm reading. The Q&A section. The chat is too busy. So all right. So let's take it, Michael.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here on this incredibly important subject with all of you in the Melissa Institute. I mean, what a program. And, you know, I almost wanted to disconnect my Zoom after I saw those incredible presentations by Nick and Nilo, and just, you know, I'm in awe to be on a panel with really what I consider heroes. I mean, doing this incredible tough work. You know, and Nick joked about the data, saying, you know, you get so much data, so much research that we need, because we all know we live in an echo chamber these days where people want to get into their corners, and especially on this issue, fight so much when we all know we have the same goal. I mean, we have one goal. There isn't a person on the right or left, and whether it's even in the NRA, that wants any gun violence. Nobody wants it. And obviously, Nilo, with your great office, unfortunately, when you put a lot of those victims up there, those were my clients. And you know, I say to people, it's kind of pathetic that, you know, that I'm a trial lawyer in the United States of America who specializes in gun violence. I spoke to a bunch of law students recently saying, how awful is that? That that somebody could specialize in that. My goal every day in my practice is to put myself out of business. You know, I don't want to ever see another gun violence victim. Obviously, the Parkland families, you know, UVA, when you talk about this issue touching everyone, I coached Deshaun Perry. And if people don't know, Deshaun Perry is one of the three University of Virginia football players that died in that tragedy. And I coached him on a youth football field. And then to think that I would have to represent his family. And so the layered approach that we have seen today to try to get to this resolution is incredible. And the one thing I would add, just from my perspective, is, you know, I think we always have to think of this, that it's a uniquely American problem. You know, there can be battles on a lot of issues, but one thing is indisputable in terms of the data, and that is we make up 5% of the world's population, actually less, but we have yet 90% of the world's gun violence. And I think sometimes we have to look at what are the differences then? Why is that occurring? And I think Nick touched on a lot of it, and it's not simple. I mean, it's got a number of different layers to it, but honored to be with all of you to try to get to the end of this epidemic in our country.
Thank you, Michael. Nilo, do you have any questions for Nick or vice versa before we move on to other questions?
Nick's presentation was thorough, very, very thorough. And I've worked with Michael's firm, and I know the work he's doing, and it's great work.
Great. Let me just move to some of the questions that we have. Let me take one from the from the audience. This one says, to the person who mentioned the class action lawsuits, I heard one organizer say that if all parents took out the maximum life insurance on their children, the insurance companies would have no choice but to lobby Congress for gun reform, as if it is the leading cause of death, as it is the leading cause of death in children. Anybody in the panel?
Well, I'll jump in there just because, obviously it's dealing with lawsuits and those kind of things. And it is an interesting thing. I've heard people suggest that, because of when you have 40,000 people die a year by gun violence, and insurance companies would have to then deal with it. But I do think, obviously, if the audience doesn't know, one of the things that I do is I represent victims of gun violence in what we call negligent security lawsuits, where there isn't security at a mall, there isn't security at an apartment complex. Like with King Carter's case, it had prior shootings, and King Carter simply at the soda machine and is gunned down. And I've gone to the biggest big businesses you can think of. I mean, the number one private commercial entity that has mass shootings is Walmart. Not even close in terms of, and I may have a case against them there where they committed negligence, but the truth of the matter is Walmart is all over the place. They're a fabric of America. You would expect them to be the number one site of mass shootings. And Walmart has participated in the solution. They've come forward saying, look, we're not going to sell assault rifles. We're not going to sell ammunition for assault rifles. We are going to have specials where if you are a first-time gun buyer, you would like it, you are going to get safe storage materials. We will give you safe storage to prevent, obviously, accidental gun deaths of children and even suicides. Walmart, is almost to the point of joining the effort with Brady, Giffords, and others of going to Congress for sensible gun reform because they are a victim. Our healthcare industry is a victim. And I sue insurance companies every day, but let me tell you, insurance companies are victims. They're paying for these losses, and they would benefit tremendously from a reduction in gun violence and obviously sensible gun violence reforms in Washington. Nick mentioned PLCA, which is the Firearms Protection Act. There are only two industries in the United States of America that have blanket immunity. And Nick's right. There's some exceptions. They're narrow. They're small windows to get through. You can't get through them in the state of Florida, but you could in Connecticut, as people might remember the Sandy Hook tragedy and the victory against Remington. PLCA and Big Tech, who's on the front lines of Washington right now to lose their immunity. And so there's very interesting coalitions to remove tech immunity in Washington. I'll put it to you this way, the sponsors of that bill in the Senate are Maria Cantwell, Democrat from Washington, and Ted Cruz, Republican from Texas. I don't think we can find another issue they agree on. But removing tech immunity is one. And I'm not saying we could do that with PLCA tomorrow, but people need to know that, Nick mentioned, why do we have airbags? Why do your keys in a hotel room no longer have a room number on it? Because those companies were held to justice in courtrooms. And I venture to say that if Smith & Wesson, Remington, and others had that same accountability, we might have a different result. So I think it's an interesting thing about what the viewer said about insurance companies.
Just briefly, what I would add to that, and my data, Nick's data supports this. The communities that are suffering from a lot of this gun violence are communities of color and poor communities. I remember when my son was born and I took out an life insurance policy. So God forbid something happens to me and my wife, he can be protected. It's expensive, right? It's expensive. And so sometimes it's difficult for these communities to say, well, you know what, we're all going to take out life insurance policies for our kids. when a life insurance policy can be incredibly expensive.
And I'll just add that, as Michael said, there is a lot of innovation, a lot of different ways, using, cities or partnering to sue over ghost guns and having them banned. And there's different things that are happening. It's really an exciting time for kind of litigation. I will say that, again, like I mentioned a lot about cities and states like California really are experimenting and trying things. And I think that's what's exciting about this laboratory of democracy, where San Jose is the first city that is requiring gun owners to have some kind of liability insurance. Otherwise, they're fined $250. Again, it's complicated because it's only for unintentional or accidental shootings. It's very difficult when things are kind of on purpose. And if it happens to you, it's different than if it's someone that's a guest in your home. But I'm excited to follow the numbers and see what happens. There's not a lot of unintentional shootings in San Jose, so it'll take a while to get enough data. But I think we need to encourage people to try things and experiment. There's not one gun law that's going to solve everything. Because gun violence, you have to look at unintentional shootings, domestic violence, community violence. There's so many different ways, and so we're going to need a lot of different solutions. But I think we need to try everything.
Now, this question for Nick, it's both you and Alex Piquero talked about about the spike caused by the pandemic in violent crime, and then about the decline following that. And then I think you alluded, if I heard you correctly, that you and Alex are going to be looking at more carefully at that. And so my question to you is, what are your theories about what caused those spikes during the pandemic and the declines now?
Great question. I think people had a lot of assumptions about what's happening at first, and now that we've got a little bit more distance, a little bit more data, I think there's a little bit more of a consensus that we don't know exactly what was the biggest contributor to the increase and then the decline, but that there were some really common factors that we're seeing in cities across the country. One thing that I believe was happening, and a lot of people believe that maybe isn't true, but the data doesn't bear out, was the George Floyd protests. Living in Baltimore, I know that Baltimore had a 30% spike pretty much overnight after Freddie Gray, like a decade ago. And it kind of matched the 30% increase we saw in 2020. And there was this theory that, well, we know in Baltimore there was just people not trusting the police, not reporting crimes, not participating in trials, and not being part of that. Individuals and victims and survivors need to be part of the criminal legal system to hold people accountable. And also, concerns about a pullback effect by police, that they didn't want to be seen doing something that's maybe risky or dangerous that could lead to more violence. But actually, the big increases happened before the George Floyd protests. And so I think there was something else going on that might have happened, definitely happened locally, maybe in Minneapolis and other places. But I think that theory maybe not as strong as originally we thought it was. And I do think there's a few things in the criminal legal system, like backlog of cases. We know that swift and certain justice is more important than how long of a sentence is. And so people were thinking that they could operate with impunity because they weren't going to be held accountable for a year or two with the backlogs. Some issues with the court systems and crime labs, I think. But I think really a lot of it is just, I think a lot of people agree that public safety is not just about law and order. It's about community and people, whether it's not having access to schools or domestic violence kind of programs or pro-social things to do. I think we lost this kind of fabric of society and our norms, and people were kind of out for themselves and doing riskier behavior. And I think now that we're able to kind of back to a new level of normalcy, people are still engaged in these government programs and social services. And I think people are resolving conflicts in different ways. And so I think there's a big part of that, but there's a lot we really need to unpack because it happened so quickly in such an unprecedented way. We're really going to look at, weekly by city and state and see where the increases started happening, when they started declining, and look for some similarities. But we talked about community violence interrupters. Like, these people are on the front lines, both of the public health epidemic, encouraging people to stay home, wear masks, get vaccinated, stay safe, and try to get people to stop using gun violence to solve their conflicts. And it was, in Baltimore, when I was working in the city government, we were working to try to get more people vaccinated. It'd be heartbreaking to hear from these mostly young Black teenagers. They're like, why would I need the vaccine? Like, I'm going to get shot first. I don't need to be worried about this virus. And so, like, we had these credible messages. Like, I get it. I live in these communities, but we're here to keep you safe, and we need you to take these actions to keep you alive, and then hopefully eventually to thrive.
Nick, we're looking forward for the findings of the results of that research, and we'll promise to try to do what we can to bring you back as part of our series on innovations in violence prevention, and to talk about that along with Piquero when that's available. Thank you for doing that. A question, I believe this is for you, Nilo. I said, given that there are still tragedies like the unfortunate killing of Gamali Holly's son, can you talk about what training has been implemented in Miami-Dade for officers responding to those calls, including potential domestic violence?
I don't want to speak too much, because I don't work for the Miami-Dade County Police Department, but let me tell you about some of the trainings that I am aware of. There's a number of new techniques that Miami-Dade Police is doing, that the City of Miami Police is doing for purposes of domestic violence, especially before a shooting occurs. A lot of officers are now being trained in de-escalation. They're actually being trained in mental health, right? So that they can go to a scene and really, instead of going as a traditional police officer, they're going in as, they're still a police officer, but they're really trying to de-escalate the situation, right? So we're getting a lot of police officers are trained in that aspect. These officers often will also respond to calls of an apparent suicide or somebody threatening to commit suicide, right? We're sending a lot of folks who are not just trained in law enforcement, they're trained in mental health, they're trained in de-escalation, they're trained in learning how to speak to folks who are maybe going through crisis. That has become I don't know if it's a national trend, Nick and Michael may better speak to this, but in the county, this is becoming a very, very big trend where we're having a lot of officers with really more expertise in these types of situations. Let's de-escalate. So that is great to see, and hopefully that'll help. In terms of school, I'm sorry, Nick, and in terms of school shootings, especially Miami-Dade public schools, Miami-Dade public schools a couple of years ago hired about 100 new police officers, because really what they wanted to do is make sure that every single public school has at least one full-time, fully uniformed officer on campus, right? And so that's one level of deterrence. This all happened, of course, after Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, after a number of other school shootings. And so if you drive now to a public school, before they used to swap where an officer would be at what school. What we're seeing now, if you drive through a public school, every single one will have a marked Miami-Dade Police Schools car and a fully uniformed officer on campus a half hour before school starts, so about an hour after school ends, full-time every day.
And you know what's interesting with that is, I mean, you think about what we have to do, to think about that, because, where it's come, like, just talking about, it used to be a shared, now we've got that school budget is going towards that. And not to be a downer on that, but if you've seen the Uvalde tapes, if you, unfortunately, I've gone through the reenactment of the Parkland shooting with the AR-15 in those hallways, and people can question all those Uvalde officers. I'm not going to get into that, but when you hear that sound, you can't, first of all, you can't tell how many gunmen there are. because it sounds like there might be an absolute Navy SEAL unit on the other side of those walls. So, I go back to kind of what Nick was alluding to, is that these community partners, meaning school districts, the money we have to spend, that goes away from our children, our police resources, needs to be part of the efforts to get those type guns off the streets. And just like everyone said, that's one part of the solution. And we can go through the statistics, but getting assault rifles back where they weren't an issue, puts a lot of strain off of our schools, because that is the main threat when I say main threat, it's the main result of the mass casualties. And it is a part and parcel approach, all these different things. It's not one simple solution, but that's an easy one. And we know where that polls. That polls at, I think it's the last one I saw was 65% of the American public. So I just say that because I applaud. I don't know if everybody saw the article recently on Broward County schools talking about metal detectors in all high schools. And we know that's coming next. So anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there because I think it's amazing that we have to do those things, and we do have to do those things when there's a simpler solution, but we haven't gotten there yet.
And if I could just add in a couple things, I mean, you mentioned domestic violence, which is one of the, I think, very difficult because, talked to a lot of law enforcement. It's the least favorite and most dangerous call they can get. Things can change really quickly. You have to assume that the person is armed. The dynamics are very difficult, and those are when officers are most likely to be shot. And we do push back against some of the trainings that law enforcement get the kind of killology trainings where they say every day this might be you might not return home, and it makes you less likely to de-escalate. And there's a great new book, The Danger Imperative, looking at some of these trainings. But we have seen much better trainings happening. I think Nilo kind of referenced, like, I've gone through crisis intervention training with law enforcement to learn how to identify when someone is in crisis and how to de-escalate and protect yourself. And one of the big things we talk about at CAP is that, look, every major law enforcement agency has vacancies, and it's been very difficult to hire new people. And a lot of times when you give more incentives and bonuses, people kind of just move around a bit. And we might not be able to get back up to full staffing. And whether or not you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, like, it's a real thing that every police chief is really facing. And so there has to be ways like, all right, what can we take off the police's plate? Sometimes if someone is, at risk of hurting themselves, maybe sending an armed police who maybe isn't the best. And there's other mental health training people, but with so many firearms, and assuming that even people that are legally prohibited, they have firearms, police are going to have to play a role, even if it is a co-response, because we don't want, mental health providers to be shot at. And so it's very difficult, but I will say there is a lot of money in the Bipartisan Safer Community Act that Congress passed, billions of dollars to really have more school counselors and more mental health providers, and better training for law enforcement and providers, and that's great. But it's unfortunate that Florida does, after Parkland, they did pass a red flag law and extreme risk protection order. And even some of the most conservative sheriffs that testified against it, they're the ones that are using that law the most, because it's one of the best tools they have to, instead of waiting until tragedy happens, law enforcement community, before these shootings, they're like, oh, we knew something eventually was going to happen with this guy, talking about zombies and like in mental health crisis, but we had to wait until they fired the first shot, and that's unacceptable. And so it's great that they passed it and they're using it, but Florida is the only state with a red flag law that did not take federal dollars to train law enforcement on how to best respond. And so there's money being left on the table for politics, that I think advocates on both sides of the aisle need to be like, no, like, we need better training. We need to use the laws on the books, and we need to make sure that all that money that's available for free to states is being spent. And so for people, I think this is one way. Anybody who's, if you don't do this for a living, if you're just on here because you're curious, like, you can ask your school district or your city council or other people, like, hey, like, what about that federal money and how's it being spent? And are we getting those counselors? And we just need more people in the schools that are there to be our eyes and ears. And the one last thing I'll say is that, you know, it's not a surprise that we're seeing more police and more metal detectors in schools. You know, if you're a principal or a parent, you want your kid to be safe. But we're seeing that potential school shooters are adapting. They know that it's very difficult to get a gun in. And so we're seeing these incidents mostly happening before dismissal, right in front of the school, or afterwards, or more likely at a football game on a Friday night. And we're encouraging law enforcement and schools and the community to prepare for those incidents before they happen and make sure that they're not just focusing on kids in schools where there's rarely guns, but on their way to and from school and at football games, because that's where we're seeing just way too much violence.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. This question is for Nilo. I mean, obviously, you're proud with a good reason about the positive effect of the gun violence unit in Miami-Dade County, and so it begs the question, you know, so what's next with that? Are you expanding? Are you going to have more units? What is going on, or is going to go on with that?
That is a great question, and thank you. The state attorney would like to expand the unit. Here's the problem, and I don't want to go off tangent. One of the things that's happening to the state attorney's office, this one, and the state attorney's office across the state, to public defenders across the state, is that the low level of pay is making it very, very difficult to hire and retain talented lawyers. That is something that we as an office and statewide have been struggling with for the past couple of years. 2 years ago, the state attorney, along with many other elected state attorneys from the state of Florida, went to Tallahassee. We were able to get a fairly significant raise, but really the state attorney's office hasn't had a raise from Tallahassee in over a decade. And so we are, you know, before this last raise, we were in the bottom 4 states of level of pay for prosecutors.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're hurting. In the last, since COVID, we have lost over 120 attorneys.
Mm-hmm.
And so we as an office, we're hurting in that sense. So, you know, in order to expand the program, you know, the state attorney is still fighting in Tallahassee to make sure that state attorneys and, quite frankly, public defenders and police officers are paid a reasonable wage, given how expensive it is to live in Miami, and how expensive it is to get a bar card. And so that's one of the things that we're struggling with. Otherwise, yes, we would love to expand the program. The program works. We have it in 2 jurisdictions. We would love to expand it further to get further data, because we really, really believe that this is the way to investigate homicides and contact shootings, is to have prosecutors and investigators work as a team, because you get a better investigation, you get a legally sound investigation, which usually leads to a good result in court and justice for the victims. So yes, in a perfect world, we would like to expand, but we're having a bit of a recruitment and retention crisis, and it's happening all over the state of Florida.
Thank you very much for explaining that to us, because I was thinking, you know, obviously this is a low-hanging fruit, but not if you don't have the resources to do it.
It is a low-hanging fruit. I'll just add one more thing. As recently as the COVID period, the starting salary for an assistant state attorney in the state of Florida was $58,000. That is 4th lowest in the country. So we're requiring folks to get a law degree, which Mr. Haggard knows is quite expensive, right? Then we're asking them to live in Miami, which we all know is quite expensive. And then we're going to pay them $58,000. That's, you know, even for folks like me and many others that say to themselves, I want to do public service. That's what I went to law school for. I want to give back to my community. I want to do it in the courtroom. That's what I want to do. It's just difficult to live in this city with that salary when you have mounting student loan debt, right? Like most new lawyers do. And so that's one of the hurdles that we're trying to cross.
And let me just introduce you to our founding scientific director, who sent me a text saying, I want to join in. So he's one of my bosses. So here he is. Don Meichenbaum is here with you. Don.
Well, gentlemen, that have all been terrific presentations. Let me point out three things that is relevant. One is in terms of shootings in schools, peer warning systems are most likely one of the major kinds of preventative events. And we, the Melissa Institute, with our colleague Ron Slaby, has developed an entire set of videotapes of how policemen at school and elsewhere can develop relationships with their students so that they see that they're not snitching, but that they're providing safety both for potential perpetrators and the like. So I encourage both you and the audience to take a look at these videos that he has developed. Secondly, you may hopefully appreciate that I have recently completed a book on spouse abuse, intimate partner violence. And the notion of this book is how women can make smart choices in terms of the mates that they hook up with. And therefore, the list of warning signs that Nilo commented on are part of the overall ways in which individuals, in this case women, can make smart decisions. The third point for the Melissa Institute is we have found out that if you can help students in reading comprehension by grade 3, they rarely, if ever, get in trouble with the law. So the Melissa Institute has 500 free movies, including Hialeah, Florida, of the best teachers engaging these students. And it turns out that reading comprehension is highly correlated with who graduates high school, who remains in, and so forth. So we think that early prevention, even before they come to school, is really important, especially since aggressive behavior is stable over time, and that you could predict from preschool into high school into adulthood as to who will be likely to be perpetrators. So I think the Melissa Institute will have a number of resources that address the issues that you are focusing in on.
Thank you, Don.
In terms of school, one of the things that our office does through our community outreach program is we visit schools and we talk about our START program, which is a presentation we do tailored to young kids about the dangers of guns, the dangers of getting arrested and things of that nature. And we go around all through the county and we present this to students in middle school, high school. We've even done it in some colleges, and to really talk about the dangers, both legally, right, and otherwise, about being involved with guns and playing with guns. And for any school that's interested in that, please reach out to me or my office, and we're happy to go to you or your organization and present the presentation to you.
Thank you very much. You know what? This makes me think, and maybe to use the opportunity to have a policy expert like Nick with us. It might be a good time, Nick, to ask us to tell us a little bit about how the new Project 2025 from the Heritage Foundation, what does it say about the gun violence prevention?
Yeah, so I talked a lot about state and local work, but there's a lot happening at the federal level, and before every kind of election cycle, people start putting out proposals of like, if our side wins, what would we do? And I think it's just interesting to take a look at what's been out there and what's at stake for people that care about gun safety. And so Project 2025, what's interesting is the Heritage Foundation is really spending a lot of money with over 100 coalition organizations. And it's very interesting that, they talk about, there's always like, oh, certain people want to defund the police, and you know, one party supports the police and the other doesn't. But there's a big effort to undercut the role of federal law enforcement, like the ATF, the only agency that can really partner with local law enforcement to trace guns and to hold traffickers accountable. And their budget was cut by $50 million already this year. It's not theoretical. They're already one of the most underfunded agencies, and they're continuing to shrink. And they want to move them out of the Department of Justice. In some of the related proposals, they want to do this thing called concealed carry reciprocity, which is, you know, in some states you can apply and get a concealed carry permit online. If you have a pulse, you can get one. And then some places like New York, they don't want tourists carrying a loaded firearm in Times Square without a background check or knowing who they are. And there's this race to the bottom of, you know, for driver's licenses, if I have a driver's license in Maryland, I can drive in Florida. That's because pretty much every state has the same. You have to do a behind the wheel test. You have to take a test. You have to have insurance. But there's so much difference among the states for carrying a gun. And so one thing that we're emphasizing is that these things that are been theoretical, like, really could happen, where just anybody can carry a gun, and kind of lawlessness, and the gun laws that are in these states. I said that some states are getting much safer because they have strong gun laws as a protective factor. Those can be undermined at the federal level. And so we continue to see most of the action at the state level, but there's a lot to be concerned about, not only the Supreme Court, but there's a lot of efforts to they want to defund, this proposal is to defund law enforcement training, close law enforcement training centers. The COPS office provides a lot of assistance to localities for gun violence and crime reduction initiatives and staffing and prosecutors. And this could all go away. And so we've had a lot of wins, and we're protecting our wins, but it could always go away very quickly. So I saw something that'd be worth kind of mentioning at this inflection point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a question here that it just disappeared from my, it's a question about, it's an invitation for the panel to talk about suicide and the use of firearms for that purpose, and what can you say about that, and what can be done? And let me just in response also to the audience, member of the audience who wrote about that, we are planning to have a specific session on that during the Innovations in Violence Prevention series, specifically dealing with suicide through firearm. And we already have on our YouTube channel a couple of courses by Professor Dan Santisteban that speaks about self-harm and different ways to really deal with it and to prevent it. So, but just to let you know, that pass the question to you.
I'll start with something. I'm not a PhD, I'm not a psychologist, but I'll start with simple technology. I don't know if you all remember testimony on Capitol Hill where one of the congressmen said the smart technology is available. I can leave my iPhone on this dais. No one can open my iPhone. And we have that in a million different products. And the technology is absolutely available for any type of firearm, or whether it be fingerprint, whether it be a code to enact a safety. And so therefore, now, obviously that only involves the transfer of a gun. Somebody can legally buy a gun and everything along those lines. But again, when we talk about a layered approach, and Nick can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe of the 40,000 gun deaths a year, a majority or a huge amount are suicides. What amount of those are guns that are not owned by the person? We could eliminate those with that smart technology right away. And it's available. I mean, we all know every day. I mean, we can't watch the news without seeing another AI intervention. Everything that's going on in our world, and some of it can be great. So I would just start with that, but really defer to all the experts on here about what can be done from a mental health perspective.
Okay.
No, that's exactly right. That's definitely should be part of the strategy. I think What's interesting, there are certain policies specific for suicide prevention that are effective. We used to have waiting periods, and that was meant to be a cool off period. If you wanted to go, you're upset at your boss, you have to take a break. And it turns out that most people that kind of commit that type of gun violence, they're able to find another firearm pretty easily. But it actually was really helpful in preventing gun suicides. And I think it's important. When I was leading Maine Gun Safety Coalition, and we finally passed some really strong laws this past week, still a ways to go, but I would always say, like, we have a gun violence problem in Maine, and they're like, no, we don't. I'm like, well, we have a lot of domestic violence homicides and we have a lot of suicides. They're like, well, suicides, they're gonna just find another way to attempt suicide, and it's really wrong. Like, we've learned that having access to a firearm really makes a difference in so many cases, because most people spend less than 5 minutes, contemplating or planning self-harm. And a lot of times if you use pills or something, you have an opportunity to change your mind, and that happens frequently, and calling an ambulance. But with firearms, it's so easy, instant, and so lethal, you don't get a second chance. But 90% of people that attempt suicide do not end up dying later from suicide. A lot of times, if you can remove that lethal means and they have to substitute with a different method, you have a chance to save their life. You hear so many about people that will jump, and halfway down, they'll be like, why did I do that? And, we've been putting nets in under bridges where that happens. But there hasn't been the same thing for firearms. And so for us, there are certain policies, but really the same things of permit to purchase and safe storage and red flag laws, the same things that prevent interpersonal violence also really are effective with suicide. And it's a big myth that really bothers me when people say, like, oh, we'll find another way, we ignore it, write it off. It doesn't matter. It does matter. And working with survivors who've lost loved ones, parents, children to firearm suicide, especially with guns, again, like Michael mentioned, that weren't their guns but were unlocked and unstored. It's really devastating.
Thank you very much. One last question, I think, for the whole panel, and we all are believers in gun violence prevention. That's why we're here, and so is the audience. And each of the speakers today have talked about prevention as a key component of their ideas on this. So the question is more about what kind of recommendations, suggestions you have, or about people in the audience can do to be part of the solution, to be part of this, to kind of like be able to be agents of gun violence prevention.
Loaded question, right? We can do an entire panel discussion on that. Again, just speaking as a member of the state attorney's office, we need more prosecutors, right? We need more prosecutors so we can target violent crimes and bring justice to those victims, and bring those to justice who are offending. And that's something that we're really struggling with. So as a state attorney, that's my 2 cents. Nick brought up a lot of great questions about lax firearms. As we know, just recently, the Florida legislature, took away permitless carry. So now we're what they call a constitutional carry state. Most law enforcement don't agree with that change in the law. They'll tell you they don't agree with that. That was a bad move, right? And so it's hard now to define a good guy versus a bad guy when everybody's allowed to have a gun. So these gun laws are something that we really have to pay attention to. And this is not an anti-gun stance. The Second Amendment means something, and so this is not what this is about. But it is about making sure that those who have guns know how to use them safely, as opposed to giving guns to folks who are reckless or who are mentally ill or who are felons. And those are the folks that we got to protect society from. So those are my main 2 takeaways. But it is again, we can have a panel discussion on just that. But those are just as a prosecutor, those are some of the things that I'm seeing.
Yeah, and I would add, you know, I think just listening to this discussion today, there's so many things we know that work. You know, there are, and we've talked about being multi-layered, but there are steps that we know that work. So for someone to get involved, I mean, there's this incredible organization right here that has task force. I can tell you, you know, Giffords has obviously expanded heavily into Florida, and one thing that they're doing is they're having meetings with moms, with teachers, with community activists to start working on these different things from outreach. So if you want to be involved, there are a lot of avenues to do that through obviously the Melissa Institute, through Giffords, through other groups, to get involved on a grassroots level with these solutions that already work and trying to promote those locally, statewide, and even federal. So, you know, and it's an uphill battle. I mean, we talked about, you know, these little victories, but what I love about Nick's presentation, it shows it works in the states that are doing it. And so the proof is in the pudding. You can make a huge difference. At times, I mean, I can tell you, flying back from Washington, those aren't fun flights. You know, after you try to get something passed sometimes. But you can do it at this grassroots level because you also have the will of the people. We know what the polling really shows. We know how people really feel. So I would really encourage folks to reach out to this great organization here, but also Giffords and others that have the grassroots, you know, task forces ready to go.
That's exactly right. I want to thank my fellow panelists and the Melissa Institute. This has been really, really wonderful. And yeah, exactly what Michael said, that, you know, we're only seeing this progress after so many. I mean, it is really hard being in this gun violence movement. You know, a decade ago, people would come, they'd work for a couple of years, and they would get burnt out because we weren't making progress, and we were up against a movement that was decades ahead of us, the gun lobby movement. But because folks are showing up at the city level, or, you know, it's really not a lot of fun at first, but then it's so meaningful to go to Tallahassee with, again, Moms Demand Action or Giffords or Brady, and, you know, really show up and make noise, and it's working. We're seeing that the conversation really change even in places that are conservative or a lot of gun owners. You know, again, it's exactly what Michael said. We want people to be trained and responsible, not take away their guns. And I think people just need to keep calling and asking your local and state officials what they're doing about this, and making sure that they're balancing accountability measures and making sure that the prosecutors and the crime labs and the police have the tools they need to hold the small number of people driving violence accountable, and also invest in prevention that will make, not just reduce violence, but make everyone healthier and safer. And just any little thing you do, it really makes a difference. It sounds silly, but when you call your member of Congress and say, hey, I support this bill, do something about gun safety, you don't have to be an expert on it. You just need to show your support. They pay attention, and it moves the needle. And that's how we're able to get 10 Republican senators to support massive investments and making gun trafficking finally is a federal crime. So prosecutors at the federal level can finally hold people accountable that are bringing in guns to states with strong gun laws. And so it's working, and you just need to keep showing up and not losing hope.
Thank you very much. You know, from our perspective at the Melissa Institute, what we do is try to provide the best research-based information that we can get on all of these topics, so that those who have the power and the capacity to effect changes at the policy level will be well informed. Those who are making recommendations or taking actions at the school level can deal appropriately with it, knowing with some confidence that what they are trying to implement has some evidence behind it. Those who are trying to help the victims are also working with confidence that they're using procedures that are known to work and to assist those. So, together with your more advocacy recommendations and involvement in the political sphere, I think that the solution includes both. And I think we're happy and proud of had you all be part of these conversations, and that has taken us up to this point. Don, I don't know if you wanted to say anything. I don't want to pull rank and get you not give you a mic. Is there anything?
No, I just think this morning was terrific, and I thank each of these participants. And that the Melissa Institute has a lot of resources appropriate to these topics, all the way from making schools safer to prevention and treatment of people who are highly suicidal. And I encourage all of the attendees to visit the Melissa Institute website in order to see the many presenters we've had who have discussed this topic previously. But a special thanks to each of the participants this morning.
Thank you. So thank you all. And again, congratulations to all of you. We owe you big time. This was great.